welcome and thank you for joining me here at the Cottonwood Room at the Laramie County Library. We're always grateful to the library for hosting these events with the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra. And all of us at the Cheyenne Symphony Orchestra are grateful to have you here and to have your support of symphonic music in our community. The concert this weekend has some wonderful treasures, musical treasures on it. We have Dvorak's 8th Symphony, which is just such a fantastic piece, full of optimism and joy and a sort of reflection of life in the country in Bohemian. We have Beethoven's 3rd Piano Concerto, performed by the wonderful English pianist Michael Roll. Michael sends his apologies that he's feeling a little under the weather today. He needs to save his energy for rehearsal tonight, so he won't be able to join us here in the library today. And then we'll open the concert with Engelbert Humperdinck's prelude to his opera Hansel and Gretel. Yes, I like how that, even just talking about that, brings out some chuckles in the audience. Hansel and Gretel is a wonderful children's opera, but in terms of its musical composition, it's actually quite a wonderful piece of music, deserving to be performed by our symphony on our Masterpiece series. And although the opera itself, has the Brothers Grimm as a basis, musically, this is very much akin to something that you might expect from Richard Wagner. Engelbert Humperdinck started out as a young music student, and early on, when he was still pretty young, came under the influence of Richard Wagner. Thank you very much. How's this? Better?
Yes.
Great. All right. He helped Wagner prepare some of the music and scores and parts for the premiere of Wagner's opera Parsifal in Wagner's Theater Bayreuth in Germany. And as a young person, this had a lasting influence, I think, on his musical style. When you look at the score, it's the prelude for Hansel and Gretel by Humperdinck, the score that I'm using to conduct from. It actually looks on the page very much like a score of Wagner. All the indications are in German. There are certain German idiomatic things that are particular to Wagner. Even the arrangement of the instruments on the score has a sort of influence of Wagner to it. Wagner experimented with how to have a conductor's score laid out. At the time that Wagner was writing, things like that weren't already set in stone like they are nowadays. And so Wagner would experiment particularly with the French horns, who sometimes serve as part of the woodwind choir, and sometimes serve as part of the brass choir. And in many Wagner scores, you'll see the French horns appear above the bassoons in the score. That's how it is in the Humperdinck score that I'm using for tomorrow. So there are these little touches that show the influence of Wagner. Wagner's use of musical leitmotifs is also kind of present in this piece. So in the opera, Hansel and Gretel, it tells the story. And in Act 2, Hansel and Gretel are in the forest. They're visited by the Sandman, who waves some special fairy dust and sand to have them fall asleep. And just before they fall asleep, Hansel and Gretel sing their evening prayers, which is like the equivalent perhaps of "Now I lay me down to sleep." But in German, it's "Now I lay down, and 14 angels watch over me. 2 at my head, 2 at my feet, 2 at my right, 2 at my left, 2 to keep me warm at night, and 2 to take me into paradise, love's sweet paradise." It's a beautiful, beautiful prayer, and in the musical setting of this, in Act 2, it's just so touching. This music from Act 2 is what begins the prelude, and will begin our concert. And it sounds like this. The French horns. French horns although it's an opera designed to introduce children to opera and to engage them in a story that they might know, it's not really necessarily scored in a way that's simplistic or overly innocent. It's a very rich use of orchestral textures and kind of advanced harmonies. And so it's really kind of also for adults, if you will. After a little bit, the music changes quite a bit. There's a theme that's announced in the trumpet, which I like to think of as a young Hansel in the story, trying to show that he's brave, that he can survive. Although I have to say, in the opera, it's very interesting how Humperdinck really has Gretel as more of the older sibling who really takes charge. And it's interesting because when I was studying the score, before I saw the opera as a whole, and I didn't reread the Brothers Grimm per se, there seemed to be some parts that were like a young Hansel, the trumpet part that we're about to hear, and then a very sweet feminine Gretel. And I thought, oh, she's a sweet young, no, actually in the opera, she's kind of a bossy older sister. Let me see if I can find some of these. I'd like to still hear some of the musical characterizations of them here. Let's see if I can find that. All right, let's see. Here it is. Here's Hans. That's my interpretation. I don't know, maybe that's something else in the story. So does it sound like a sweet answer and feminine sort of present? Now it's like you go into the woods and the forest with them. There's scary sounds. Strings. There's all this excitement. Another main theme comes in here. It does sort of reflect the innocence of children. To a moment that sounds a little bit like an homage to Wagner's Maestro and sort of dreamy, takes you to another land and time of fairy tales, and maybe even helps us get back in touch with our own innocent childhood memories. So I really am excited to perform this piece. I feel like there are still some people who might not think that this piece is necessarily art music and worthy of this type of concert, and I wholeheartedly believe it is. And I hope that after you hear us perform, you'll recognize that this little prelude is a symphonic masterpiece, just a wonderful little concert over. And then after the Humperdinck, by the way, I didn't mention at all about Engelbert Humperdinck's name being used by a British pop star in the 1960s. Yeah, that you know about that probably more than I do. I don't know. I'm not an expert on the singer Engelbert Humperdinck. I know he had some really big hits. I think it was interesting that he started out using the name closer to his real name, and then once he adopted the name of the German composer, his career suddenly took off, which is interesting. Also, I don't know any connection between this composer and the Princess Bride movie. But if you do know that, I'd be very curious to know, so please find me. The Beethoven Third Piano Concerto will come after that, and this is a piece that shows us Beethoven in all of his masterful intensity. Some people like to characterize Beethoven's music really too bluntly as being early period, middle period, late period Beethoven, right? You've heard that before. And one of the things that's interesting about the Third Piano Concerto is that it was published much later than it was actually written. In fact, the sketches for it go back to when Beethoven was in his late 20s, in like 1797, like 1798, things like that. But it wasn't premiered until 1803. That doesn't seem like a huge difference, but in those 6 years, Beethoven's music and his life completely changed. Right around 1800 is when he first started realizing, when he was about 30 years old, that the deafness that was starting to happen was going to be irreversible and lifelong. And that was right around that time that he had to come to terms with, continuing to live a life devoted to music, but as a deaf performer and composer. And I mention performer because at this time, early in Beethoven's life, he was more known as a pianist than as a composer. When he first came to Vienna, he wowed the folks there in the musical community with his piano playing, his improvisations. And in fact, at the premiere of this piece, when it was first performed in 1803, Beethoven himself did play the piano solo. But what's interesting is that the piece has come down to us as a later opus number. It was published a little bit later. And so many people may not realize that the sketches for this were early, which is good because this is not an early Beethoven piece. This is Beethoven securely in that middle heroic period, where very much of the style of the Eroica, even the later, middle piano sonatas and later piano concertos even. So in this piece, though, there is something, how in his earlier music, in his early period, they say there's a little bit of the influence of Mozart and Haydn. Okay, well, in this piece, there is a bit of the influence of Mozart, for sure, and Haydn, perhaps, but what's interesting is that this is like that middle period mature Beethoven coming through wholeheartedly, but with a strange sort of maybe homage to Mozart. Mozart wrote a C minor piano concerto, the same key as this piece, and Beethoven was a huge fan of it. In fact, one time it was well documented that Beethoven went to a performance of another pianist playing that Mozart piano concerto, and he said to his friend next to him, "We could never write music like that, could we? That's such a great piece." Some people have even tried to find a connection between the opening of this Beethoven piano concerto and the opening of the Mozart. Let me see if I can find that. Here's a little bit of the opening of the Mozart C minor piano concerto. This is one, you might call it. This first movement theme, some people have noticed that the part, it goes, the ending of that, many people thought, sounded very much like drums, like the timpani, bum, 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 bum. And Beethoven himself may have recognized that quality of it. And he's kind of, in an interesting way, he prevents the drums from ever doing it, the timpani drums in the orchestra of this piece, until near the very end of the movement. After the pianist plays a cadenza, he leads out, and then in very quiet, hushed tones, finally the timpani plays bum, 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 over and over again. And it's part of this amazing conclusion. But before all, this first movement is kind of broad in its scope. It's not as actually long as the first piano concerto's opening, but like certain kinds of conventions of piano concertos at the time, the orchestra plays all the themes of the first movement before the piano comes in at all. So that was pretty unusual. I mean, that was normal back then. It's unusual to have the pianist come in right away, which that's how Beethoven basically starts his fourth and fifth piano concertos as a surprise. But this is kind of the normal thing. So the orchestra, while the pianist just sits there for about 4 minutes, just plays through the themes and gets ready and sets it all up. So you hear an entire, what we call sonata or exposition. So it's, different kinds of themes all presented in the orchestra. Then finally, it's like, oh yes, we have to bring it back for the soloist. The orchestra cuts that off, and suddenly the soloist comes in with running scales, and then works through the themes with the piano as well. So it's kind of a lengthy first movement in that respect, because it goes through those motions. Now this is one of those pieces for which we have Beethoven's own personal cadenzas, for the moment near the end of the first movement where the pianist plays by him or herself and traditionally has improvised on themes that came before it. After the premiere, it was actually many years later, I think in 1809, a student of Beethoven's convinced Beethoven to write down one of his cadenzas of this. I think they were never the same. Whenever he played this piece, he probably played it differently from time to time because he was improvising. In fact, at the first performance, there's a funny story about the page turner who was there sitting next to Beethoven. It doesn't even seem like a page turner was necessary because Beethoven had the whole thing in his mind pretty much. And I don't know if you've ever seen any of Beethoven's manuscripts, but they're like chicken scratch of a madman. I say that lovingly. But the poor page turner couldn't see what was going on because there were just a few little indications to Beethoven of some like reminders of where he was. It wasn't all written out. And so likewise, I'm sure his cadenzas at that first performance might have even been different than the ones that he later, 6 years later, wrote down. But because we have Beethoven's own cadenzas, it gives us a little bit of a peek into what it would have been like to hear him improvise and to hear him take the themes that were presented in the formal structure of the first movement with the orchestra and the piano together. And then when the piano has a chance to have free reign and improvise on those, that's what he did. And so we have a glimpse into Beethoven's improvisations, which is so wonderful. And so most pianists these days play the Beethoven cadenzas, because how can you top that, really? You're playing the Beethoven concerto, and Beethoven's cadenzas exist. That's what we're doing. So, and they're amazing cadenzas, by the way. Leading out of the cadenza, Beethoven does that trick with the timpani playing the bum, 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 bum. And that's not the only thing that's surprising about that special moment. Because normally in a concerto at that time, once the pianist finished a cadenza, the orchestra would come in with just sort of a loud entrance to finish off the movement in kind of a strong way. But Beethoven brings the orchestra in a way that it's almost part of the cadenza still, and it's a dreamy kind of reflection of what's been going on. It's a continuation, in a sense, of the improvisation of the cadenza. And then finally, that comes to an end. Let me see if I'll play you a little bit of this. I'm jumping all over the place, but this is near the end of the first movement of this concerto. It's going into the cadenza. pianist who has a big ego. Decided to do their own cadenza. Sorry, almost everybody else. So here's the end of the Beethoven cadenza. And it's like this mysterious moment. This would have been unthinkable just 20 years earlier during the time of Mozart's generation. This is so like romanticism. Finally, the chorus comes crashing. This concerto has three movements, a fast, slow, and then fast movement. The slow movement of this one is particularly beautiful and poetic. It starts with the pianist Bohemian herself, and it starts in this remote key of E major coming after C minor. And so one of the things that Beethoven is hoping for is that the audience ears will be slightly jarred with the entrance of that second movement. So now you've heard the ending of the first movement, and you have that, kind of tonality in your mind, that C minor, that really strong kind of thing, right? Then, this is what comes next. Sort of seems like an homage to Mozart. So the part that comes up features the flute with the violins, and it sounds very much like, in my opinion, the slow movement of Mozart's. Just an amazing moment there. Mozart's concerto for flute and harp. In a way, there's an homage to that here. He leaves out trumpets and drums. That's understandable in a slow movement, a sort of more quieter, slow movement like this. But he also leaves out the oboes. It's interesting. And he really highlights the flute and bassoon together, which aren't necessarily two equivalents that you would normally bring out a lot together. Clarinet doesn't have a big part in this. It's surprising. So there's those things. Then there's the way that it's written. For those of you who have studied music a little bit, you might find it interesting. This piece is written in an unusual meter. It's written in 3/8 time, but it's so slow. It's a largo, and it's so slow that the 16th note gets the beat. Does that seem strange? For those of you who know music, usually the 16th note is a very small fraction of a beat, right? It's like a fourth of a beat normally. But in this case, I'm conducting 16th notes. It's so amazing. And it means that when there are fast notes happening, they're either 64th notes or 128th notes. There are 128 notes in this music. This is an interesting choice that Beethoven made to write it this way. And perhaps it goes back to the ideas, perhaps of like Baroque forms and the Baroque ideas of what is a largo and what is the pulse. And maybe it's also perhaps Beethoven's way of saying, don't get too slow. But, I mean, it's really like impossible actually to conduct it in 3/8, the meter that it's printed at. But at his time, they would never have dreamed of writing 6/16. That's just didn't exist in 1803 when this premiered. But that's really what it is, so it's interesting in that respect too. So this is one of those Beethoven piano concerto slow movements that I like to think as being just pure poetry, like the slow movement of his Emperor concertos, just gorgeous. And there are times where the pianist plays filigree. I use that term kind of loosely, and I apologize. It's poetic filigree. But over it, there's just a solo bassoon or a solo flute where the two of them in duet play very slow-moving melodies, which aren't even melodies per se, just sort of melodic shapes. It's dreamy, is I guess one of the things that happens at that time. And then it's like we come out of the dream in a real shock all of a sudden with the third movement. The pianist starts the third movement using a kind of a trick, because this middle movement, the slow movement, is in E major, and so we hear a lot of this G sharp as part of this chord. And then to get us back to C minor, he uses that same G sharp and spells it as an E flat and goes, and all of a sudden we're back in C minor. And that's kind of fun little harmonic connection that he does here. This is what that sounds There's a bit more playfulness in this. Because I have to catch the solos out of it. This happens a lot where it dies out and then there's a little free cadenza, and then I have to catch it. After saving the sound of the oboe and clarinet, not having to play the second movement, there's a lot of it. It's a great one, point out. This sounds very stern and angry, right? It's part of a joke. Because listen to what happens. In about 5 seconds, the piano changes it and becomes silly. So that bit of dum 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 is very short-lived. So, sorry, playing. little moment, like a little fugata, but then it goes away right away. And again, the conductor has to catch the kids. That's not It's a wonderful, wonderful piece. It's just so exciting. And besides all the piano virtuosity and these different moods that Beethoven creates, there are so many subtle colorations within the orchestra too. Times where a little bit of a change of instrumentation in the winds, or suddenly the horns or trumpets play something. There's a moment where the horns, back in Beethoven's day, the horns couldn't play in all the keys that we do now. They had specific tuning to play in a certain key. And so at one point in the third movement, Beethoven has an indication that the horns have to change their vowels and change their crooks to shift from playing in one key to another. And during that time, he gives them a huge long rest, which is very nice. It's very practical, right? So he thinks it'll take them time to take their instrument apart, get that other piece of tubing and put it in. So he gives them a break. Nowadays, modern horn French horn players don't do that at all. Their instruments are designed with the valves so that they can play all the keys. But what's interesting is that during that moment when the horns have to take a break, he gives sort of a horn part to the trumpets. It's kind of a unusual, playful little moment, just to see what was going on in his mind with that. But that's another example of kind of these interesting little details in the orchestration that, if you pay close attention, I hope that you'll appreciate. We're very lucky to have Michael Roll play this particular piece with us. He's made kind of a specialty of the Beethoven piano concertos over his long career. I was kind of intimidated when I saw in his biography that at age 14, he played this concerto with the Halle Orchestra in England under the legendary conductor Sir John Barbaroli. That's Sir John Barbaroli calling right now. Yeah, so I was like, okay, and he's recorded all the Beethoven piano concertos. They got critically acclaimed, and he's been performing them a lot. And so I think we're in for a real treat. He understands his music. He gets the poetry of the slow movement, which is something that many pianists, I think, tend to miss the mark on. So we're very fortunate to have him here. I'm sorry he's not here right now, but you'll be thrilled with his performance tomorrow night. And after intermission, we'll shift gears and have Dvorak's 8th Symphony. So Dvorak, we sometimes forget that this well-known composer, Dvorak, internationally renowned even in his lifetime, started out in growing up in a small town, the son of a butcher who was supposed to be a butcher himself. His father was a butcher and innkeeper, and his parents encouraged Dvorak to take music lessons. They had no idea of his talent or what would happen with that. But viola was his instrument of choice in his sort of teenage years, and he started playing viola in opera orchestras, and that influenced him to want to try to write operas. And one of the things we forget about Dvorak is that, as wonderful as his chamber music and symphonies are, and his symphonic dances, he liked to think of himself as an opera composer. Interesting. Yeah. But his success came relatively late in life. In his early 30s, he was still playing viola in the pit orchestras, and he had hardly started to write anything yet in his early 30s. So interesting when you compare some of these other composers who, fully formed, at age 20 or something like that, like in Mendelssohn's case, or Mozart, or many others. So Dvorak had a long, I guess you would say, kind of musical gestation before he kind of came to full maturity as a composer. And that's also interesting in relation to his symphonies, because we know that he wrote 9. Because one of his most famous pieces is Symphony No. 9 from the New World, right? The New World Symphony. A recent poll by Sirius XM Symphony Hall, the New World Symphony was the favorite symphony of everybody in the world. Number 1, beating out Beethoven's 9, who was number 2. We know he wrote 9 symphonies. But what's interesting is that if you look at the music, actual sheet music of many of these symphonies, you see that number 9 is called number 5. And the symphony that we're playing tomorrow night, number 8, is often called number 4. Why is that? Well, okay. So his first 4 symphonies, he didn't think that they were worthy of publication and performance. And so even in his lifetime, they weren't known. It wasn't until after he had gone that, after he passed away, that biographers and scholars would find these other pieces and put them in the right order and change the numbers. So the New World Symphony wasn't number 5, it was number 9, and so forth. So that's interesting too. So when it came to writing this 8th symphony, there's some other interesting stuff kind of in the story behind this piece. He was already getting a lot of success. His music was being played all over Europe. He was a big success in London. And the London Philharmonic at that time, a few years earlier, had commissioned him for a new symphony, which was his 7th symphony, which premiered there. And now it came time, he wrote this 8th symphony when he took a sort of summer retreat in this beautiful countryside in Bohemia, this estate, Vysoká, which was sort of like a state-sponsored retreat in the woods for him, really. And we know that even though he had attained a certain amount of global celebrity, he was still that kid from a small town at heart. He loved pigeons, he loved nature, he loved being with his kids. It's well documented that when he came to New York reluctantly to leave a music conservatory there, he would spend all long hours at the dock just watching the ships in fascination. He just loved things like that. But he loved nature. He really loved nature, and being surrounded by the nature in the Bohemian woods at Vysoká inspired this symphony. So then he presented the symphony to his publisher. Now that's kind of an interesting story in and of itself. Dvorak, as a young composer in his maybe mid-30s, entered some music competitions for young composers. He was still very poor at the time and playing viola in the pit orchestras. And he won this competition 3 times, which gave him a lot of attention. And this important music critic, you may have heard the name Hanslick, he suggested to Dvorak, actually he suggested to Johannes Brahms, that Brahms should take a look at this young composer's music, Antoni Dvorak. And again, remember, Brahms was in Vienna, and where Dvorak was from, in Bohemia, it was part of that empire, right? So, anyway, so Brahms was very impressed with Dvorak's scores, and was so taken with him that he convinced his publisher, a company named Simrock, named after the man at Simrock, to take him on as his publisher. And it was actually because of that Dvorak's name became well known internationally, because Simrock, the publisher, said, well, Brahms says you're very talented, can you give us something that we can publish and get your name out there? And so he wrote these Moravian dances and duets, and then the Slavonic dances, originally as piano pieces and then later as orchestra pieces. And that made him well known and a fortune. So Dvorak quickly became successful, really in large part thanks to Brahms' encouragement and Brahms' connections with the publisher. So fast forward a few more years, and Dvorak puts his heart and soul into writing this new symphony, what we know as the 8th Symphony. And he was inspired by nature, and he was trying purposely to make it different than his previous symphonies that may have shown a little bit more of the influence of Wagner and Liszt. And he was trying to do something distinctively Czech with this music. And he was trying to do new musical forms and have some new musical innovations in this piece. He said he didn't want the symphony to be like anything else. So he puts all this into it, and he shows his publisher, and his publisher really dissed him. They said, we'll give you, I don't know, $50 or whatever for it. They insulted him with the amount of money that they would give to him for it. They didn't want to publish it at all because they said that his symphonies weren't selling well. And, it's hard to believe. But they wanted more of these short pieces like the Slavonic dances, which, by the way, explains why there's a whole other set of Slavonic dances that came later. But it wasn't just the money that they offered and the reluctance to even publish it at all. It was also that they wanted to Germanize his name to Anton Dvorak without any of those accents. Yes, it was very upsetting to Dvorak. And they wanted to list all the major titles in German. And they wanted, it was just part of that Austro-Hungarian Empire, right? They wanted to Germanize everything, or make it, yeah. So, and Dvorak at this point, especially with this piece, which was so full of Czech kind of folk songs and the countryside and all of that, he said no. And so, because of the connections he had made with that London Philharmonic Commission and several visits to London that he had there, he actually ended up publishing this piece with an English publisher, Novello, which is interesting because the printing of the score of this actually looks like English music, like a score by the English composer Elgar. It has that look on the page. And so he didn't accept the low money from Simrock. He went with a different publisher, and eventually Simrock sort of ate crow and gave him a lot of money, wanted to get it back, and too bad, kind of thing. And the first performance of this, Dvorak conducted in Prague, but then shortly after that, he conducted a performance of it in London. Sometimes this piece is called the English Symphony of Dvorak, or the Pastoral Symphony of Dvorak. Neither nickname has really made it, and neither one's stuck. And I thought it was interesting that we had an English pianist on the same program and doing the English, like Dvorak Symphony. It's not really English at all. It was published by an English publisher, and it was performed there a few times. Actually, one time he got an honorary doctoral degree from Cambridge, and it was performed there as well. But it's really distinctively Czech. So one of the other things that people say about it is that it does have a pastoral quality. It has a sort of sunny, cheerful kind of quality as well, compared to many symphonies. But you wouldn't get that necessarily from the very opening. The opening of this symphony is so beautiful. It was added as an afterthought, believe it or not. The symphony sort of gets started with what sounds almost like a bird call and a flute and a sunrise with an orchestra growing. But after first writing that, but before the premiere, he decided to add this sort of dark, beautiful, melancholy opening, and it sort of comes back in key moments of the first movement. And it was interesting. A friend of his said that, yes, this symphony wasn't just about the countryside. This was about the way that Dvorak himself, his soul, sometimes burdened with dark thoughts and grieving sometimes, would be lightened by the countryside. So it's not just a pastoral picture. It's about us in nature and how that nature sort of sometimes can pacify and give us healing. Here's a little bit of the movie. There's sort of shadows underneath the cello texture, and Dvorak writes those other instruments to be a little softer. Something like chorale in the trombones. And then we have the bird that announces dawn. The world starts to come to life. about that is that it's forceful, right? There are moments where it's loud, you hear the drums, it's very strong and forceful, but yet it's joyous. You don't get that combination exactly like the way Dvorak does with other composers. And I think that's so interesting. There's a sense of joy behind it. There's a positivity to the music, but yet it's forceful. It almost might sound angry to some people, but that's not, I think, the intention. The second movement, there's so much more I could say about each of these movements. The second movement is a beautiful, also contrast between some dark moments and some light moments, some bird calls, and part of like representing us in nature. It has all that in there as well. It starts with a sort of statement in the strings that's almost questioning, in a way, almost funereal. This doesn't sound funereal, but in a moment. It's hard to hear. It almost sounds like a bit like a Beethoven funeral march. Then we get the birds again. Now the two clarinets. This part is so important. The harmonies and the way that melody moves is so jacked. It's the innocent. Love that. Wonderful solo for the concert master. Some playful and sweet. Well, being being a true symphonist, Dvorak will develop this sweet music, and it's going to be loud and exciting, and it's going to take us through kind of on an amazing journey in this movie. And ultimately, the whole orchestra will be playing this innocent theme quite loudly, and the trumpets will ring out a ringing fanfare. It's amazing. The third movement is a waltz, but it's almost like a wistful memory of a waltz. Remember, being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Dvorak was probably well aware of the Viennese waltz, what it sounded like. And he decided to try to make a waltz that was just very distinct and different from a Viennese waltz. And it does have Czech, I think, overtones in it in many ways. Here's how it sounds. This is the third. So it does have a kind of Bohemian flavor to it, I think, don't you think? Yeah. The middle section brings in a theme that, again, is sort of like a moment of remembrance of the innocence of childhood. Let's see if I can find it. Okay, it's this theme. More innocent than that, but maybe it is about young love. At the very end of this movement, he takes that theme and he kind of changes it around, almost completely masking it, but taking it from a triple meter, a waltz, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And he changes it to a duple meter, so it says and so it's kind of a playful musical hiccup beat almost. And this is the way he decides to end the movement in a very fun and playful way. Here it comes. So this is back to the waltz, but we're about to come to a music called the coda, the end or the tail. And that's the part where it's musical hiccup. And he playfully slows it down. And it goes back to fast. And there's one playfulness right at the very end. Yeah, at the very end, I love how he ends it with that little woodwinds bump, bump, beep. And then the strings come in a little bit early, and that's the playfulness at the very end. Instead of going bump, bump, beep, it goes bump, bump, beep, bump. It's subtle. It's there. Hopefully you'll hear it. And then there's a big contrast with the last movement, which starts with trumpet fanfare. conductor, Raphael Kubelik, once told an orchestra in rehearsal, while rehearsing this, is the trumpets in our country do not announce battle, they announce the dance. That quote has come on quite a bit. So there's kind of a slow dance here, and the theme and variations really, again, the cellos take the melody like they did at the very opening of the first movement. And the theme itself is like a variation of the first movement, bird call theme. So this is going to spin out for a little while, have a lot of variations, and it's beautiful. And then suddenly the floor is just going to come in with like a rousing carnival. And then jump ahead into that. You get the idea. There's even this thing called lip trills. Have you ever heard of a lip trill? You know what that is? The French horns sometimes can go very quickly between two notes by moving they have those three little vowels, right? The vowels. But sometimes the notes that they have to go back and forth between, they have to do it all with their lips. They have to go. And so there's this part that's really exciting for the French horns with lip trills, and it comes through brilliantly. I'm just going to back up so you can hear it, because I think I came into that carnival music just after it. One of the hardest solos that they ever have to play. This little part for the flute. Again, maybe it's another bird, I don't know. But there's nowhere to breathe. That's what makes it hard. It's not just that it's fast, but there's nowhere. First, we have our superstar flautist, Mr. Al. But it's a lot of fun. So very exciting movement, and it just keeps building intensity to the end. There are many other episodes in the middle, of course, and it has a unique, special form. I mentioned how the symphony has each of its movements has some kind of unusual new take on like the rules of how to write a symphony, the formal rules. And he breaks them in wonderful ways here. So a lot of people say that this is one of the most joyous symphonies written, and that could very well be. You can get a sense of the composer's joy of being in the woods and being alive and so forth. So we hope that we can convey that tomorrow night. Do you guys have any questions for me?
If you were to describe when I think of Bohemian or Bohemian music, I have certain, and I'm not sure that this tells me it's Bohemian. So in your mind, what is Bohemian music?
That's a good question. I don't know if I'm qualified to really give a definitive answer about that. I haven't spent a ton of time there. I've been to Prague and that area. But,
I mean, I think of gypsies.
Gypsies, yeah. And there's something
so
about those.
Gorgeous.
Yeah. There, his Slavonic dances seem so Bohemian too, but I guess is Slavonic music and dance and culture part of it? I guess so. I'm not sure. There's just that general term of what is Bohemia, and I think that was in a way almost like a term for the parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire that weren't in Vienna. Those parts anything to the east, whether it's Budapest or Prague, anything like that was Bohemia. But I'm not sure what makes something Bohemian. That's a really great question. But I think maybe Dvorak, by using so many of these like little folk songs and little turns of phrases that sound very ethnic Bohemian or Czech, I think that might be one of the ways. It's a really great question. Other questions?
I was curious about the Humperdinck, the brass parts in particular. Does he write the same way that Wagner did, with telling us what the key and trumpet is in?
Right, yes.
Writing a note and then they have to transpose that, or the conductor does.
Right. Sometimes, like I mentioned with the French horns, changing valves, changing their tubing, Wagner does that as well. So in this particular prelude, it's short enough that the trumpets and horns don't need to do that as extensively. They can stay in one key. And it's hard to know, though, whether this is editorial or something that Humperdinck himself wrote, whether the trumpets are in F or the whole time or something like that. But it's a good question. Anything else? Well, thanks so much for joining me, and I'm sorry we didn't have Michael roll, but we'll get to hear out tomorrow night.